We now come to capitals and courts. There were three cities which were considered to be capitals at different points of time. They were Agra, Delhi, and Lahore. Akbar did commission the building of a new capital at Fatehpur Sikri, but it was abandoned some years later due to water shortage. Now, Fatehpur Sikri lay on a direct road to Ajmer. Akbar was a great devotee of Sheikh Moinuddin Chishti, and he also commissioned the construction of the marble tomb of Sheikh Salim Chishti. The enormous arched gateway, the Buland Darwaza, was also meant to remind visitors of the Mughal victory in Gujarat. In 1585, the capital was transferred to Lahore to bring the northwest under greater control because there had been some skirmish by the Safavids in the northwest, and Akbar wanted to closely monitor the frontier, which he did so for 13 years. Shah Jahan, of course, built a new capital at Delhi, Shah Jahanabad, in 1648. We now come to the court. The physical arrangement of the court focused on the sovereign. So you see the king here. He is at the heart of all proceedings. He's the heart of society. The throne was very, very important, which gave physical form to the function of the sovereign as the axis mundi. Then there was the canopy on top, which was a symbol of kingship in India for a millennium, and was believed to separate the radiance of the sun from that of the sovereign. In court, status was determined by spatial proximity. How close were you placed to the king? So if you were a courtier placed very close here, you were supposed to be very high in hierarchy, as opposed to those who are the farthest from the king. Once the emperor sat on the throne, no one was permitted to move from his position or leave without permission. So this shows you what strict etiquette that had to be followed in courts. Social control in court society was exercised through carefully defining in full detail the forms of address, courtesies, and speech which were acceptable in court. Slightest infringement in etiquette was noticed and punished right away on the spot. There were different forms of salutation which would indicate the person's status in the hierarchy. Deeper the prostration represented higher status. So the highest form of submission was sajda, or complete prostration before the emperor. Under Shah Jahan, these rituals were replaced with the char taslim and the zameen bos, or the kissing of the ground. An ambassador presented to the Mughal emperor was expected to offer an acceptable form of greeting, either by bowing deeply or kissing the ground, or else follow the Persian custom of clasping one's hands in front of the chest. Now, when Sir Thomas Roe visited Jahangir's court, he simply bowed before Jahangir and further shocked the court by demanding a chair. So as you can see how cultural differences can lead to some tensions. So what was the emperor's daily routine like? So the emperor begins his day at sunrise with personal religious devotions and then appeared on the small balcony on the Jharoka facing east. Below the Jharoka would be a crowd of people, including soldiers, merchants, craftspersons, peasants, women with sick children, who waited for a darshan of the emperor. After spending an hour at the Jharoka, the emperor walked to the public hall of audience, or the Diwan-e-Aam, to conduct the primary business of government. Here the state officials would present reports and would make their requests. After 2 hours, the emperor would move to the Diwan-e-Khas to hold private audience and discuss confidential matters. High ministers of state placed their petitions before him, and tax officials presented their accounts. Occasionally, the emperor would also view the works of highly reputed artists or building plans of architects. On special occasions such as the anniversary of the accession to the throne, or Eid, Shab-e-Barat, and Holi, the court was full of life. Perfumed candles were set in rich holders, and palace walls were festooned with colorful hangings, which made a tremendous impression on visitors. The Mughal rulers celebrated 3 major festivals in a year: the solar and the lunar birthdays of the monarch, and Nowruz, that is the Iranian New Year, on the vernal equinox. On his birthdays, the monarch was weighed against various commodities, which were then distributed in charity among the poor. Titles and gifts. The grand titles were adopted by the Mughal rulers at the time of coronation or after a victory over an enemy. The Mughal coins carried the full title of the reigning emperor with regal protocol, but titles could be granted to others also, to non-royal people as well, especially men of merit. The title Mirza Raja was accorded by Aurangzeb to his 2 highest ranking nobles, Jai Singh and Jaswant Singh. Titles could either be earned or paid for. So we have Mir Khan, who offered 1 lakh rupees to Aurangzeb for the letter A to be added to his name to make it Amir Khan. Other awards included the Robe of Honor or the Khilat, a garment once worn by the emperor and imbued with his benediction. Then there was another gift called the Sarapa or head to foot, consisting of a tunic, a turban, and a sash. Jeweled ornaments were often given as gifts by the emperor. The Padma Murasa or the lotus blossoms set with jewels was given only in exceptional circumstances, usually to the heir apparent. A courtier never visited the emperor empty-handed. Gift of either a small sum of money, which was called nazar, or a large amount of peshkash was always offered. In diplomatic relations, gifts were regarded as a sign of honor and respect. Ambassadors performed the important function of negotiating treaties and relationships between competing political powers, and in such a context, gifts had a very important and symbolic role. Let's now move to the imperial household. The imperial household was mainly the haram, meaning a sacred space. The Mughal household consisted of the emperor's wives, concubines, his near and distant relatives, which would include mothers, step and foster mothers, sisters, daughters, daughters-in-law, aunts, children, etc., and all female servants and slaves. Now, marriage was a very important way of forging alliances. The gift of territory was often accompanied by the gift of a daughter in marriage. It was through the link of marriage and the relationships that developed as a result that the Mughals were able to form a vast kingship network that linked them to important groups and helped them hold a vast empire together. So, marriages were extremely important. Now, when we come to the wives and concubines of the emperor, distinction was very well maintained. Wives who came from royal families were called begums. They were married after receiving huge amounts of cash and valuables as meher. They also received a higher status and greater attention from their husbands. Then there were the other wives or the agas who were not of noble birth. And finally, you had the concubines or the agachas who occupied the lowest position. Now, each of these wives and concubines received monthly allowances in cash, gifts, etc. according to their status. The lineage-based family structure was not entirely static. The aga and the agacha could rise to the position of a begum depending on the husband's will and provided that he did not already have 4 wives. It also depended whether you had male offspring as well. Numerous male and female slaves populated the Mughal household. Tasks varied from the most mundane to those requiring skill, tact, and intelligence. Slave eunuchs or khwaja saras moved between the external and internal life of the household as guards, servants, and also as agents for women dabbling in commerce. Now, what were gender roles like? So when we look at the royal women, it might give us some clue. Mughal queens and princesses controlled significant financial resources. Shah Jahan's daughters, Jahara and Roshanara, enjoyed an annual income often equal to that of high imperial mansabdars. Jahara, in addition, received revenues of the port city of Surat, which was a lucrative center of overseas trade, and this enabled important women of the Mughal household to commission buildings and gardens. Jahara, for example, participated in many architectural projects of Shah Jahan's new capital at Shah Jahanabad. Among these was an imposing double-storied caravanserai with a courtyard and a garden. The bazaar of Chandni Chowk, the throbbing center of Shah Jahanabad, was also designed by Jahara. An interesting book gives us a glimpse into the domestic world of the Mughals, and that is the Humayun Nama, which was not written by any courtier but actually by Gulbadan Begum. Gulbadan Begum was a daughter of Babur and Humayun's sister and Akbar's aunt. Gulbadan Begum could fluently write in Turkish and Persian, and she describes in great detail the conflicts and tensions among the princes and the kings and the important mediating role elderly women of the family played in resolving some of these conflicts. Coming to administration, let's look at the imperial officials. How were people recruited? What was rank like? So one important pillar of the Mughal state was its corps of officers, also referred to by historians collectively as the nobility. The nobility was recruited from diverse ethnic and religious groups, which ensured that no faction was large enough to challenge the authority of the state. The officer corps of the Mughals was described as a bouquet of flowers or guldasta held together by loyalty to the emperor. In Akbar's imperial service, Durrani and Iranian nobles were present from the earliest phase of carving out a political dominion. 2 ruling groups of Indian origin entered the imperial service from 1560 onwards, the Rajputs and the Indian Muslims or the Sheikzadas. The first to join was a Rajput chief, Raja Bharmal Kachwaha of Amer, whose daughter Akbar got married to. Members of Hindu castes inclined towards education and accountancy were also promoted. A famous example was Raja Todarmal, the finance minister of Akbar. Iranians also gained high offices under Jahangir. Aurangzeb appointed Rajputs to high positions, and under him, the Marathas accounted for a sizable number within the body of officers. Now, how were they ranked? This is where the Mansabdari system comes into play. So, Mansabdari system is both a civil as well as a military setup. So, all holders of government officers held ranks which were called Mansabs, which comprised two numerical designations. Zat, which was the indicator of position in the royal hierarchy, and the salary of the official, and a savar number which indicated the number of horsemen that he was required to maintain in service. In the 17th century, mansabdars of 1000 zat or above ranked as nobles. The nobles participated in military campaigns with their armies and also served as officers of the empire in the provinces. Each military commander recruited, equipped, and trained the main striking arm of the army, which was the cavalry. The troopers maintained superior horses branded on the flank by the imperial mark or dag. The emperor personally reviewed changes in rank, titles, and official postings for all except the lowest ranking officials. Akbar, who designed the Mansab system, also established a spiritual relationship with a select band of his nobility, usually the highest levels, by treating them as his disciples or murid. For members of the nobility, imperial service was a way of acquiring power, wealth, and the highest possible reputation. A person wishing to join the service petitioned through a noble who presented a tajweez to the emperor or an application. If the applicant was found suitable, a mansab was then granted to him. So you needed a sponsor in the court. You couldn't just walk up one fine day and say, okay, you please employ me in your service. So you needed a sponsor. Let's look at some of the most important ministers of Akbar's court. The first was the Mir Bakshi, or the Paymaster General. He stood in open court on the right hand side of the emperor and presented all candidates for appointment or promotion, while his office prepared orders bearing his seal and signature as well as those of the emperor. The second important minister was the Diwan-e-Ala, or the finance minister, who was in charge of all the state revenues. And finally, you had the Sadr-o-Sudur. He was the minister of grants or Madad-e-Maash, and he was also in charge of appointing local judges or qazis. The three ministers occasionally came together as an advisory body, but each of these ministers acted independently. Akbar, with these and other advisors, shaped the administrative, fiscal, and monetary institutions of the empire. The nobles stationed at the court or Tainat-e-Rakab were a reserve force to be deputed to a province or military campaign. They were duty bound to appear twice daily, morning and evening, to express submission to the emperor in the public audience hall. They shared the responsibility for guarding the emperor and his household around the clock. Now, with such a large empire, how did information travel around? So, the Mir Bakshi, apart from being the general paymaster, also supervised the corps of court writers or Waqia Navis, who recorded all applications and documents presented in the court and all imperial orders. The agents or wakils of nobles and regional rulers record the entire proceedings of the court under the heading News from the Exalted Court with the date and time of the court session. The akhbarat contained all kinds of information such as attendance at court, grant of offices and titles, diplomatic missions, presents received, or the enquiries made by the emperor about the health of an officer. This information is valuable for writing the history of the public and private lives of kings and nobles. News reports and important official documents traveled across the length and breadth of the regions. Under Mughal rule by imperial post, round-the-clock relays of foot runners carried papers rolled up in bamboo containers. The emperor received reports from even distant provincial capitals within a few days. Agents of nobles posted outside the capital and Rajput princes and tributary rulers all assiduously copied these announcements and sent their contents by messenger back to their masters. Now, if you move beyond the center, provincial administration was also extremely important. The empire was divided into provinces or subas, where the three important ministers that we spoke about were replicated. They had their corresponding subordinates. That is, they had the Bakshi, the Diwan, and the Sadr. The head of the provincial administration was the governor or the subadar, who reported directly to the emperor. Each province was then divided into sarkars or districts, and they often overlapped with the jurisdiction of the Faujdar or commandants, who were deployed with contingents of heavy cavalry and musketeers. The local administration was looked after at the level of the Pargana or sub-district by three semi-hereditary officers, that is the Kanungo, who kept revenue records, the Chaudhry, who was in charge of the revenue collection, and the Qazi or the local judge. Each department of administration maintained a large support staff of clerks, accountants, auditors, messengers, and other functionaries who were technically qualified officials and functioned in accordance with standardized rules and procedures. Persian was made the language of administration, but local languages were used for village accounts. The Mughal chroniclers usually portrayed the empire as highly centralized, but actually this was not true. The relationship between the local landed magnates, that is zamindars, and the representatives of the Mughal emperor was sometimes marked by conflict over authority and a share of the resources. And the zamindars often succeeded in mobilizing peasant support against the state. Now let's look at some foreign policy. Now, we know that the Mughal rulers adopted high-sounding titles, including the general titles as Shahenshah, meaning King of Kings, or very specific individual titles such as Jahangir, the Caesar of the world, or Shah Jahan, or King of the world. But it did not mean that they were literally kings of the world or king of kings, and it in no way meant that they had no diplomatic relations and conflicts with neighboring political powers. Let's first look at the Safavids and the position of Kandahar. The political and diplomatic relations between the Mughal kings and the neighboring countries of Iran and Turan hinged on the control of the frontier, of the natural frontier, which was defined by the Hindu Kush mountains. All conquerors who sought their way into the Indian subcontinent had to cross the Hindu Kush in order to access northern India. A constant aim of Mughal policy was to ward off this potential danger by controlling strategic outposts, especially Kabul and Kandahar. Now, Kandahar was a bone of contention between the Safavids and the Mughals, each claiming Kandahar to be their own. The fortress town had initially been in the possession of Humayun, lost for a while and then reconquered by Akbar in 1595. While the Safavid court retained diplomatic relations with the Mughals, it continued to stake a claim to Kandahar. In 1613, Jahangir sent a diplomatic envoy to the court of Shah Abbas to plead the Mughal case for retaining Kandahar, but the mission fails. And the winter of 1622, a Persian army besieged Kandahar, and the ill-prepared Mughal garrison was defeated, and Kandahar was lost to the Mughals forever. The relationship between the Mughals and the Ottomans was marked by a concern to ensure free movement of merchants and pilgrims, because the Hajj route also coincided with the Silk route. This was especially true of the Hijaz, that part of the Ottoman Arabia where important pilgrimage centers of Mecca and Medina were located. The Mughal emperor usually combined religion and commerce by exporting valuable merchandise to Aden and Mocha, and distributed the proceeds of these sales in charity to the keepers of shrines and religious men. However, when Aurangzeb discovers that all this money was being misappropriated, he favored that this money be redistributed in India, which he thought was as much a house of God as Mecca. The Catholic Jesuits had arrived in India along with the Portuguese in the 15th century. Akbar was curious about Christianity and dispatched an embassy to Goa to invite the Jesuit priests to come and tell him about this new religion. The first Jesuit mission reaches the Mughal court at Fatehpur Sikri in 1580 and stays for about 2 years. Two more missions were sent to the Mughal court at Lahore in 1591 and 1595. Jesuits have also left behind a lot of accounts and observations. Most of them are quite personal, which shed light on the character and mind of the Emperor Akbar. At public assemblies, the Jesuits were assigned places in close proximity to Akbar's throne. They accompanied him on his campaigns, tutors his children, and often were also companions of his leisure hours. The Jesuit accounts corroborate the information given in the Persian chronicles about the state officials and the general condition of the Mughal times. Now, Akbar always questioned formal religion, especially orthodox elements. When Akbar shows a lot of respect to the members of the Jesuit mission, some of the Jesuit fathers actually were quite convinced that Akbar was very close to converting. But then Akbar doesn't, and then they don't know what to do with it. In fact, they themselves came from a place where religious persecution was rampant, so they didn't quite understand Akbar's broad mindedness. Akbar's quest for religious knowledge led to interfaith debates at the Ibadat Khana at Fatehpur Sikri between learned Muslims, Hindus, Jains, Parsis, and Christians. As Akbar's religious views matured, and as he discussed more and more with scholars of different religions and sects, he tried to move away from orthodox Islamic ways of understanding religion, and he moved more towards a self conceived eclectic form of divine worship focused on light and sun. Akbar and Abul Fazl created a philosophy of light and used it to shape the image of the king and ideology of the state. In this, a divinely inspired individual has supreme sovereignty over his people and complete control over his enemies. So, with this, we come to the end of this chapter.